Many of you probably don't know this about me, but my professional life as a photographer for over 20 years was spent photographing private gardens, primarily gardens right across Canada. I worked for gardening magazines, and most of those images were used for articles for those magazines. Now, unfortunately, as many of you probably already know, many magazines have folded or they're having a hard time, especially the paper magazines. And the gardening industry in Canada was hit pretty hard, and I don't even think there's any gardening magazines left in Canada, or very few. So as a result of that, I more or less lost my job, and that's how I ended up doing workshops and YouTube and so on. But the neat thing about photographing gardens was that, first of all, it was very close to photographing nature, and also I was able to make a living out of it. So the two kind of went hand in hand. I took photographs of gardens for the magazines to make money for a living. And then the nature photography, I did make some money out of it, but it was more of a hobby. And I just enjoyed going outside and taking photographs in the wilderness. So what do gardens have to do with composition? Well, I can tell you right now that after photographing hundreds of gardens over a 20-year period, you really start to hone in on your compositional skills. If I compare the two, photographing a wilderness area to photographing a garden, especially a well-designed, laid-out garden, photographing gardens, I find anyway, is quite a bit easier. Because if you come across a well-designed garden, it's all laid out for you. All you have to do is stand in the right spot, and the composition just falls away in front of you. A well laid out garden will have compositional elements such as contrasting colors, center of interest, contrasting textures. I mean, the list goes on and on. It's very much like putting together a composition in your viewfinder, except it's already laid out for you. A couple of other differences between photographing for, say, a client or a magazine over just photographing for yourself is that, first of all, the photographs that I took were more literal. They were just a direct copy of what I was seeing in front of me. There wasn't really any artistic merit on my side other than composition. The other important difference was that for many of the images, I would have to back up or zoom out to give the editor a little bit more room around the photograph so that they were able to crop it to fit a certain page or a layout. Now, having said this, now that I'm shooting pretty much for myself, I like to really fill the frame, and it doesn't matter what format it is, whether it be 4x5, 5x7, or 3x4, or square, or whatever. I usually end up composing for that format. Now, don't get me wrong, having the ability to crop an image after the fact is a great tool to have in your toolbox, especially if, say, you didn't quite get the composition that you wanted, or you didn't have a long enough lens and you need to crop in a little bit. It's a great tool. For me, the fundamentals of composition start with usually either an idea or finding a subject that I'm attracted to. And then once I've found a subject, it could be, like in my last video, it could be light itself as a subject or a physical subject. Once I've defined what it is I want to photograph, then I'll start to zero in on that subject and purposely eliminate the things that distract the viewer from that subject. So you define what it is, and then once you've defined, start whittling away from the center outward, looking for things that are either going to help your subject and bring attention to it, or things that are distracting it. If they're distractions, then ideally you want to try and get rid of those things. So one of the reasons why I chose some of my garden images for the subject matter in this video is that I have a lot more examples of where I've started off quite wide and slowly worked my way in, taking lots of images as I go and finally coming to the image that I actually want. Now, I'm not sure if it's because I have a lot more experience now or because I'm just shooting differently, but what I'm finding now is that a lot of the time I'll just zero in right onto my subject, and any increments that I make are usually by the inch. And so if I showed you those, you probably wouldn't notice any difference. So that's why I'm showing you these garden images, because the increments are quite large and you can really see what I'm doing here. So in this first image here, it's pretty obvious that I've found a nice scene. The garden's really pretty. It's got some great plants in there. But I haven't really defined what it is I want to show my viewer. You'll notice that on the left side we have a bit of a sundial, and then we have some sky at the top with some telephone poles. I haven't quite finessed this. You're not really sure what the center of interest is or what the image is actually about. Now, after I started to figure out what it is that attracted me to the scene and started getting closer and closer to eliminating some of those distractions, I think you'll all agree that this second photograph here is a vast improvement over the first one, because now all of a sudden I have a concrete idea of what it is I want to photograph and what I'm trying to portray in this photograph. Now, there isn't really a center of interest in this photograph other than perhaps the bright red fuchsia in the background, but it gives you a good idea of where my starting point is and where my finishing point is as well. In the second photograph, we have this beautiful bed of flowers, and then we have a statue kind of just off to center. And the main subject for me in this photograph was the statue itself. That's the nice thing about gardens. Whenever you put a man-made object into a garden, usually that ends up being the center of interest. One of the problems that I had when I was photographing gardens is that a lot of times people would have too many knickknacks or statues, so I'd have to zero in on one or perhaps move a bunch of them and just put one in there so there weren't too many distractions from the main subject. This photograph's quite good, but there's a number of things in here that I didn't really need. I don't really need the grass at the bottom. I don't need the dirt at the bottom. I could really zero in a bit more into that statue and improve on this photograph, and that's exactly what I did. In the second image here, I've zoomed in right onto the statue. The frame is just filled with glorious flowers and greenery and all these textures and colors. So basically, at the end of the day, all I'm really doing is just simplifying. You just keep simplifying and simplifying until you get to the very bare bones of what it is you're trying to portray in an image. You'll often hear artists, designers, and photographers refer to balance within a composition or a design. So what is balance or visual balance? Well, balance is a way of providing unity and order within our composition. The principle is that if we have a subject that dominates a scene, one way to harmonize the composition is to introduce another subject that will take some of that visual weight away and act as a counterbalance, and ultimately providing a more pleasing, harmonious image. Okay, now there are a number of different types of balance. There's symmetrical balance, there's radial balance, there's even one called crystallographic balance, which I have a hard time even saying. But most of my photography concentrates just on two of those, and that's symmetrical, where you have one side might be exactly the same or a mirror image of the other side, and asymmetrical, where you have somewhat of a visual tension portrayed by contrasts. Asymmetrical is often more visually interesting because it's somewhat abstract and there is no symmetry. With asymmetrical composition, you're arranging elements with different visual weights. But even with those contrasts, you're able to arrange them so that they balance each other into a unified composition. This old 4x5 image from the Narrows in Zion National Park is a great example of trying to keep the balance in a composition. You'll notice that the trees on the upper left and the three boulders on the bottom left, it kind of shifts all the weight of the image over to the left side. But what's holding it together is that one boulder that's on the right side about a third of the way up. If you took that boulder away, the whole image would shift and it wouldn't be quite as visually interesting. It just wouldn't look right. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about asymmetrical balance. And in many of my images, I'll often use a combination of both symmetrical and asymmetrical designs to compose my photographs. So as an example, here's an image of Mount Assiniboine in Assiniboine Provincial Park. And you'll notice that I've plonked the mountain right in the center of the image, up at the top, but more or less in the center of the photograph. But each side of the photograph from that mountain outwards is different. It's almost the same, but it has some visual differences, especially the foreground where we have those rocks. I just find this kind of composition quite pleasing to the eye, and I do this often. In these last few examples, I want to implement some of the things that I've talked about throughout this video. So we first talked about simplifying our composition by defining what our subject is and then eliminating the things that don't enhance that subject. And then secondly, we talked about balance. Now this photograph here, this is an old image from Mount Seymour Provincial Park. It was taken with a 4x5. And there's a few things going on here that don't quite sit with me. First of all, the image is not that well balanced. Now, generally speaking, darker areas in a photograph, in this case the shadows, tend to have more weight to them. So if you have an image with lots of shadows and all the shadows are on one side, then that one side is going to look much heavier than, say, the other parts of the photograph where it's much lighter. So to this image, when I say it's off balance, most of the visual weight seems to be on the left side. The other problem with this is that we have that slope of white snow in the foreground, and it's all sloping down to the left side. So that doesn't help either. And while we're talking about white snow in the foreground, it doesn't really add anything visually to the composition. It's just a big white blank space. So ideally, I want to simplify this photograph as much as possible, but still maintain the original reason why I took it. So we have to figure out, well, why did I take this? Well, I really love that little mountain top in the background. That was the main attraction for me, plus the tall trees just to the right side of that mountain. I also really love the shadows, but what I ended up doing in the final image, and I'll show you that in a minute, is I actually brightened them so that they wouldn't have so much visual weight on that left side. And here we have the final transparency, and you can see this is a direct scan. You can see the edges of the transparency. I much prefer this image. I've really simplified the composition. I've taken away the things that didn't need to be in that original composition, and I've just simplified it. Now the image looks quite a bit more balanced to my eye anyway. The trees on the upper right side tend to be balanced with the trees in the lower left side, and I just absolutely love that little mountain in the middle there. Now, as far as the very final image, once I'd scanned this, I brought it into Photoshop and I just opened up the shadows just a little bit. So there you have it. We've gone from defining our subject matter, simplifying, and then trying to balance out everything into a meaningful composition. That's what I really love about photographing trees just covered in snow, is that it really simplifies your compositions. All right, everybody, I really hope that you enjoyed this second video in the series about composition. I'm trying to cover things that perhaps other people haven't covered in the past. So let me know what you think of the video. Leave a comment down below and be sure to give me a thumbs up if you did enjoy it. Lastly, if you haven't noticed, I now have what's called a join button on my channel. It's basically a subscription-based platform where you pay a small fee per month for extra content. And of course, it doesn't mean that I'm taking away from my regular content. I'm just adding a little bit more. In this case, some extra videos on processing. So if you're interested in that, be sure to check it out. All right, everybody, thanks ever so much. And I will catch you next week. Bye for now. Thank you.